Here we saw a situation where it seemed to be an ideal setup for a cartel. We had 3 railroads going a key area from Chicago to Omaha, where the Union Pacific had its eastern terminus. There were 3 railroads, 2 of which were owned by the same guy. Right, so you had something like that. And these 2 guys then got together and formed a cartel and said, okay, we'll cut the shipments, we'll raise the freight rates, and the Union Pacific won't be able to do anything about it. They'll be stuck. And we saw, it started in 1870, we saw that even under these ideal situations, the cartel was smashed. What happened, to repeat, is that Union Pacific began to look around for ways of getting around this, and they finally put together or discovered there's a Burlington system which went all the way down to St. Louis and up, and dealt with them, and thereby breaking the cartel. Even though, of course, it was a longer route. But since these 3 railroads were charging a much higher rate than before, it paid for them to go look around and get organized and get together with these St. Louis guys in order to undercut the cartel, the Iowa Pool. The Iowa Pool lasted only about 6 years, and by the 1876 or so, the whole thing was busted. There was a big rate war. And as I said, even before that, there was competition between even the same railroad owned by the same guy, because the sales vice presidents were undercutting the rates anyway. But when the St. Louis system was used, it just undercut the whole cartel. So in a free market, a cartel does not work, cannot work, even in a situation where you have only a couple of railroads, even a seemingly ideal situation for cartelists. The same thing happened with the Big 4, Big 5, so-called trunk lines. The trunk lines were as I think I've mentioned already, but I'll just repeat it. The so-called trunk lines were basically the basic lines to Chicago or from Chicago to the eastern seaboard. And in other words, there were originally 4 competing railroads. The New York Central, which went to Buffalo, and then Albany and down to New York City. The Erie Railroad, which I think went through Ohio or something like that. And the Pennsylvania Railroad, which went to Philadelphia. Note that Philadelphia and New York City are competing for mid-east-west trade. And the Baltimore and Ohio, the last one going to Baltimore, B&O. And I think Baltimore, Ohio was the last one to be built of these 4. I think it was built 1874. I think was the final building of B&O. So all these railroads competed, and they tried to get together and have a cartel. And they would, first of all, it took them a long time to organize. I mentioned before, each one wanted to have a different pricing system. New York Central had an easier grade. They want to do it by grades or whatever. So finally they get together and they make some kind of quota system. In other words, they agree, they have a trunk line cartel system. This thing is called the Seaboard Agreement. Okay? And they say, all right, here's what we'll do. We'll have a, don't forget, there's literally thousands of rates, all sorts of things. They have a very complex system here. They decide to have a quota system. They'll have a, one time they had a quota system. Erie will take 1/3 of the business, and New York Central 1/3, Pennsylvania 1/4, and B&O 10%, something like that. And then they have to have some sort of internal policing agency to regulate this. So they had a guy, they set up a whole association, because it was not illegal then, a whole association to regulate this, to run it, have representatives, the whole internal bureaucracy. They picked a guy who was a German engineer, railroad engineer, came over. He became a professional cartelist. His name was Albert Fink. And he wound up as the head of a whole bunch of railroad cartel associations in the South and the East and the West later on. And he became a professional railroad cartelist. And his job was to try to police the agreements and try to make sure that nobody cheats and all that sort of stuff. And it was also put together, helping these 4 people put together, was J.P. Morgan and Company, Drexel Morgan, which now become, since the panic of 1873, became the big investment banker. Morgan was heavily invested in railroads and underwriting railroads, and he gets all these guys together to arrive at the cartel. So you have his partner Anthony Drexel, still a big name in Philadelphia. It's still a big name in Wall Street. And J.P. Morgan himself, who was the son of a British banker who also had important connections. He didn't start off from the ground up. He started off with a wealthy and important banker, English banker father named Junius Morgan. Anyway, pretty soon Morgan became the senior partner here, became the dominant force. So Morgan and Drexel, they get these guys, they whip them into shape. Okay, let's have a cartel. Great. But it's very difficult. You have to agree on a quota. They always wanted to change the quota. See, if you have a quota system, you're in a business or in a railroad, next year when the cartel agreements, say, last for a year or two, you want to change the quota. Now I can have a more efficient system. I got a better product. I got a better machine. Why should I be stuck with a damn quota that I was engineered into signing 2 years ago? You try to reopen the quota system and get a larger quota. Constant fights among the railroads themselves, or between the railroads, or any other business. If you're in any kind of business, you kind of try to have a cartel agreement. There's a constant argument about quotas. Because everybody wants to produce more. Every firm wants to produce more. Every railroad wants to ship more. And they're always kicking against the quota. No, I should have more of a quota because I got a better machine now. I got a better product. I'm entitled to a better quota. And the other guy says, no, you're not. So at any rate, you have endless bickering and endless opportunities for the whole system to collapse, for the whole quota system to collapse in recrimination. At any rate, what would happen? They sign the quota, they have the agreement, and then it would go bust. And they'd be cheating and whatever. And literally, the system only lasts for a year. The 1877 pool seaboard agreement lasted for about 6 months. And bingo, it collapses again. They have another quota. They reorganize the quotas again. It's almost like new summit agreements, And the next 6 months later, the whole thing collapses. In the case of the trunk lines, something else happened. Namely, because of the increased profits, or because of the expected increased profits because of the cartel, a new railroad develops, a new trunk line, the Grand, I mentioned already, but it's called the Grand Trunk, which goes from Chicago to Boston through, around Canada. And it wasn't part of any agreement. What do you do with this crummy Grand Trunk? Also, the Grand Trunk was inefficiently managed. They were constantly cutting rates. They had nothing to lose, in a sense. They were constantly on the edge of bankruptcy. You have to realize another thing about bankruptcy. Most people think, I'll come back to this again later, because most people think, for example, it's easy to get another firm out of business. Let's say you have a big business, you have a smaller business, smaller firm. It's easy to force the other guy out. You undercut the rate. You have a price war. You go down to almost zero. The other firm goes bankrupt, and then you raise the price. It doesn't work that way. Because even if you do that, the other firm goes bankrupt. The bankrupt plant does not disappear. It doesn't go up in a whiff of smoke. It's still there. If you raise the price and your profits go up again, somebody else buys the bankrupt firm's assets and comes in with almost no cost. It's a great position to undercut the bigger firm again. But the bankrupt, just because you'll go bankrupt doesn't mean the plant disappears. It's still there. If it's bankrupt, you can buy it for a song. Your new firm is in business again, or it's still competing once again. And this is what happens. A constant attempt to establish this kind of a cartel, constantly going bust. So the Grand Trunk comes in and all bets are off, and of course they want to, what a new cartel firm always says is, okay, give us a quota system. They can't do that. They already think they're not producing enough, they're not shipping enough. They can't strip their own quota by 10% and make room for the Grand Trunk. So the whole thing collapses once again. The same thing happened on the Western railroads. They try to have a cartel. Usually Fink is the head of it. And again, it doesn't work. And finally, Fink says, he makes a statement as early as 1876, after a few years' experience with this. He says, he thinks about this, and he says, quote, whether this cooperation can be secured, meaning the cartel, by voluntary action of the transportation companies is doubtful. Governmental supervision and authority may be required to some extent to accomplish the object in view. And as he keeps going, he takes more and more of this position. We got to have the government to enforce the cartel. Cartels won't work in the free market. And since he's in favor of a cartel, he says we have to have governmental action, state and then federal. See, state is okay, but states only are intrastate. After all, railroads go throughout the whole country. You can't really do much in a state action. Although you start having state commissions by the 1850s and 60s. And what he says is this. By 1879, he works out a whole proposal, Fink. And he says, what we need is a federal law, with a federal commission, of course, to regulate it, doing the following things, and somehow to outlaw railroad rate discrimination. Now, by discrimination, of course, is a fancy word for saying changes in rates, cutting a rate, a rebate, charging less for long haul than short haul, because you have a lower fixed cost per unit, and you're having a longer ride. This, in other words, these are the way you compete. Railroads compete by, quote, discriminating, unquote, by giving discounts for a longer ride, giving discounts for a fuller car instead of having to load up a railroad car with 3 or 4 things, giving discounts in order to get more customers. These are ways in which, in other words, the government can enforce a cartel, outlaw discrimination, outlaw secret rebates. Remember, the secret rebate is the key here because this is the way cartelists undercut their opposition. They break the cartel by quietly, without fanfare, giving a rebate to a shipper in order to get shipments. In other words, giving a discount. It's secret because they don't want to tell your competitor about it because then he'll break the agreement. So, and talk a lot about compulsory publicity. See, it sounds democratic. In other words, you put it in such a way, you sucker in the public into thinking you're doing something in favor of competition. We want publicity. All these guys that want cartels saying, well, we don't want full regulation. We don't want the Railroad Commission to set rates. We want them to have compulsory publicity so the public will know what's going on. But the public doesn't have to know what's going on. They don't need to know the internal processes of the corporation. What they really meant was they want every railroad to know what their competitors are doing so they can enforce, there wouldn't be any secret price cutting. They can enforce a cartel agreement. He also wanted a federal commission to enforce it, okay, and to arbitrate, and also to ratify, to have the railroads get together and make decisions about rates and have the government enforce it. Government commission ratifying rates, ratifying agreements and rate agreements. Now, this is basically what happened. This is precisely, this plan of Fink, supposedly made in 1879, was precisely what the government did in 1887, passing the Interstate Commerce Act, putting in the Interstate Commerce Commission. 1886, I guess 1887 they set it up. Precisely what they did. The first government regulatory commission in the country was in railroads. It was passed in 1886, the Interstate Commerce Act, and it was enforced by putting an Interstate Commerce Commission. And, of course, there were many forces in favor of the Interstate Commerce Act for railroad regulation. ICC, which I think is going to go out of existence. I think there's a drive on now to eliminate the ICC. I can't believe it, but it might actually happen after 100 years of messing everything up. At any rate, that's for that. Yeah.
They have same policies and rates overseas.
What?
Wisconsin to each and every airline.
For airlines. That's not anymore. The Civil Aeronautics Board was enforcing them. They're now out of existence. They actually disappeared at the end of last year. There is no more Civil Aeronautics Board. There's a little bit of rate regulation in the FAA, but not much. It's really, basically we have a free market now in airlines and in trucks. We don't have it for railroads yet. But there's been a big deregulation move since the end of the last 2 years of the Carter administration into the Reagan administration. So we now have the reason why there is, by the way, they found out for 100 years that it wasn't working. To such an extent the railroads were going bankrupt. And the airlines were in bad shape. And so they finally realized the game is up. I mean, they just, after 100 years of mess-ups, I'll go into the airline. I actually go into airlines a little bit. The procedure is the same. In other words, the procedure is trying to keep out competition. And you do it in the name of monopoly. How do you do it? I mean, in the name of competition. You have the airlines get together, let's say, and this happened in the mid-30s, 1930s in the airlines. The object is to keep out competition. So you do it, cut the supply curve to the left, keeping out competitors, assigning routes. In the case of airlines, they actually assign routes. Until very recently. They set up the Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, which, by the way, has nothing to do with safety. That's the FAA, which is still in existence, and Civil Aeronautics Board, which fixed the rates at a very high level, by the way, and kept and assigned rationed routes. In other words, they said, for example, the Boston-New York route has to go to Eastern Airlines, that's it. Nobody else. In other words, they granted monopoly routes to specific airlines. As a matter of fact, in the old days, Pan Am had a total monopoly of the entire Pacific route. No other American airline could fly in the Pacific. I think Pan Am was a Republican airline. I think the United was a Democratic or something. During the early Republican years, I think they set up a total Pan Am monopoly, which was finally broken after a while. But I mean, the thing is, they assigned routes, and nobody else could compete. If you competed, you were tossed out. It was illegal. And you had the CAB issued certificates of convenience and necessity, allowing people to fly in that route. Now, originally, what happened was, there, of course, were a lot of small airlines. And the small airlines used to compete a lot. And first thing the CAB did, they said, well, you are not permitted to fly scheduled. In other words, schedule is important. You have a timetable, and the schedule says you will take off at 10 a.m., right, for Chicago or something. The small airlines are not permitted to do it. They're not permitted to have a schedule. They're only permitted to fly when they fill up or whatever it is, certain routes. In other words, you went to take a small airline, and you didn't know when you're taking off. It's already, of course, a tremendous competitive disadvantage to small airlines. There was a lovable outfit called Trans-American Airlines, as I remember. Now you have small airlines. I mean, by now, before the recent deregulation, but they're only permitted to fly on small routes. In other words, Air Wisconsin is permitted to fly from Chicago to Appleton, whom no major airline wants to fly to Appleton. It's a one-horse town, so they permit a small airline to be a feeder line. They did not permit small airlines to fly from New York, Chicago, New York, Washington, over the key routes, New York, Los Angeles. So these small airlines used to fly on the major routes. The first thing that happened was they were not permitted to schedule. Okay, no timetables were permitted. But even as a so-called non-scheduled airline, they still outcompeted. What they did was this. See, in those days, it means up through the 1950s, there was no such thing as coach and first class. Everything was first class. Airlines were extremely expensive. You really had to be almost a millionaire to fly from here to Los Angeles. So what the Trans-America and these other one-horse airlines did was they simply charged half the fee. The ancestor of the beginning of the so-called no-frills movement. No-frills was to this extent. For example, there used to be cheap airlines that flew to Europe, but they fly to Luxembourg. They fly from Iceland to New York. They fly to some dump in New Hampshire, some some little field in New Hampshire to Iceland and then Luxembourg, and it'd be about half the price of the regular flights, regular airline. So it's true they were non-frilled to such an extent that, for example, they used to weigh you along with the luggage. Kind of humiliating for us fat people. In other words, they have a maximum weight for the person plus his or her luggage. Well, all right, you take that. It's your choice as a consumer. You take a little bit of humiliation for half the price or not. My wife once took an airline from Los Angeles to New York, a small airline. Not only was she weighed along with the luggage, don't forget about safety. These planes have a great safety record. They never had an accident. But there was kind of a non-frill. For example, she was told at one point, please everybody walk to the back of the plane. Doesn't give you a great feeling of confidence. Another point, she said the ceiling started leaking, right? And so the stewardess very calmly went to the thing and just put a Band-Aid over the leak. Well, it doesn't give you a feeling of great confidence, but it got there and it was half fair. So finally what the CA did is they just outlawed them. Just summarily one day, just put all these non-scale airlines out of business. But by that time, this forced the competition. These small airlines forced the major airlines to start with a coach thing. To cut their fares in half for coach, and that was the beginning of the first class coach thing. As I said before that, everything was first class. You had to be a millionaire or be on an expense account, of course, to get to fly an airline. And then the whole thing changed because of the heroic competition of these small semi-illegal airlines. I mean, they were always on the brink of illegality. And so finally, but then what happened was you have, at one point, by the way, since the rates were fixed, you began to have competition in quality, so that you have, if you can't compete in price, you compete in other things. So you have, remember one time, there's still a very strong international cartel in Europe, so the European flights, to fly, say, from London to Paris is almost more expensive than flying from New York to London, because there's a tight intergovernmental cartel fixing all the rates, keeping them very high. So at one point, as I say, if you can't compete in price, you compete in quality. They started giving luxurious food. So then the goddamn international cartel, I forget the name, I think IATA, the International Airline Authority or something, they issued a decree that no airline traveling to Europe can serve anything except sandwiches, and you couldn't serve real food. It's part of a cartel. So what the individual airlines began to do was to undercut this. They used to serve the entire beef bourguignon and all the rest of it, except they put a piece of bread underneath and they called it an open sandwich. There's always ways. It shows you economic history is a constant fight between the market and the government. The government's constantly trying to screw things up. The market's trying to evade the restrictions and serve the consumers. And so this is, again, a beautiful example of that in the airlines. What finally happened is that after 50 years of this, the airlines got so inefficient and so monopolistic. And first of all, the costs go up. Second of all, the salaries get bid up, so the pilots and stewardesses were making an enormous amount of money, way above the market level, because they're all getting these cushy, monopolistic jobs, so to speak. And the airlines wound up not really making any money because they were so inefficient and so bureaucratic that when the deregulation movement came along in the late 1970s, they said, the hell with it, maybe we should have deregulation. And so the airlines sort of reluctantly went along with it. And what happened as a result of deregulation was a whole shift in the industry and of course much better service and lower prices and all the rest of it. Some airlines went busted because they couldn't adjust to the new free market conditions. Others prospered. People's Express, of course, is a beautiful example of no frills. Again, you find lousy service in the sense of you never know when you're taking off, but much cheaper. I think you weigh the two things. I have a colleague at this university who shall remain nameless to protect the guilty, who was a big Marxist, and his wife is an airline stewardess of some note. He was against deregulation because he said, and for proper economic reasons, he said, Jesus, deregulation, her salary is going to go down. It was the monopoly fat, so to speak, on the airline. These airlines are going to go down. Of course, that's exactly what happened. At any rate, you think it's far removed from the railroads, but it's the same damn thing. It's the same principle, just applied again in different form. The railroads, it took a little longer for this to happen. The airlines had started with only the big five or something, but basically the same principles at work. The use of the government in the name of the common good, public welfare, and all the rest of the general name of humanity and democracy and whatever other names you can think of, putting in a law in order to cartelize the system and put in by the railroads themselves or by the airlines themselves. In the case of the ICC, sure, some farmers are in favor of it, some shippers are in favor of it, but the railroads are the main force behind it, and they acknowledged afterwards, the shippers and the farmers and the railroads, gee, we're worse off now than we were before. The rates are higher, which of course they should have been able to predict. Morgan was trying to raise the rates. When the ICC came in, the Interstate Commerce Commission, they started maneuvering. They started establishing rates, usually by ratifying cartels. They get the trade associations together. They set the rates. They set the rates at exactly where. In other words, the rates are such and such. They're always going down, remember. Morgan was trying to get the rate to, say, here. When the ICC came in, they fixed the rates up, pushed them up to exactly where Morgan had wanted them, and had failed to do it because of free market action. In other words, the use of the railroads using the government in the name of competition and democracy and whatever other nonsense you can think of, using the government to cartelize the system. In other words, using the government to cartelize the industry where they couldn't establish a cartel price in the free market. This is the essence of the current system, by the way, the essence of the welfare state, the essence of all government regulation. In fact, this whole course is really a process by demonstrating this in different areas. That the welfare state, the government, the mixed economy, whatever you want to call it, is a system by which big business groups establish cartels, use the government to establish a cartel, and call it competition, democracy, whatever. It's essentially the essence of the situation. If you go down the list, as Coco points out in his book, Railroads and Regulations, if you're interested in looking at it more deeply, Coco, the one area he doesn't talk about in the Triumph of Conservatism is railroads, because he has a special book on that. If you go through the thing, if you look at most people think that big business is always against government regulation. It's not true. If you go through the hearings, you find out what these guys are in favor of. In the hearings before Congress, the railroad officials almost to a man were in favor of these bills. Of course, there were different bills. They were jockeying for power. The House bill, the Senate bill, all sorts of maneuvering within the system. That's not really very important. But the key is that they all want a government regulation. They all want a rates to go up. They all want to outlaw secret rebating. They all want to outlaw price discrimination, the whole bit. And because they realized this is what the situation was. And there's only a couple of railroad people who said, no, it should be free competition. It's a small minority. All the others were in favor of this new system of government control. Before I get to that further, I just want to talk about one of my heroes in this whole setup. One of my heroes, I already said, is James J. Hill, who actually built the Transcontinental Railroad without government subsidy, the Great Northern, and outcompeted Northern Pacific, which had lots of subsidy. Another one of my heroes is a guy named Jay Gould. There's a marvelous biography of Gould by Julius Grodinsky, a long, very interesting biography, if you're interested in this, called Jay Gould. Grodinsky, by the way, wrote another book on the Iowa Pool. If you're interested in that, he wrote a small book, definitive work on the Iowa Pool. Anyway, Gould was a great character. He was not, his forte was not building great railroads. He wasn't cost conscious. He wasn't a great manager or anything like that. He had one aim in life. His aim was to bust the cartel. He was known as a rate buster. He was hated by all the other railroad people. Because he'd buy a railroad and immediately break the agreement. He immediately start secret price cutting, all the other stuff, and he made a lot of money that way. Because you see, here's the situation economically. Going a little bit of economic theory, which is important to understand this. Every firm faces an elastic demand curve. In other words, every firm, individual firm, if you cut the price, you'll increase your sales to such an extent your total revenue will go up. For example, if Wonder Bread were cut from $1 a loaf to 60 cents a loaf, and all the other bread prices remain the same, that's the key, they'd make a lot of money, because everybody would shift from Pepperidge Farm and Tasty to Wonder Bread. So every firm has an elastic demand curve. As a matter of fact, we can prove in economic theory that every firm must have an elastic demand curve. Okay. On the other hand, the demand curve for the industry is much less elastic. And in some cases, it will be inelastic, like this. Demand curve for industry. So that means, this is the setup for a cartel. That means if you can organize a cartel, Wonder Bread prices, if you cut Wonder Bread prices, you pick up a lot of revenue. But if you cut all the bread prices, you probably wouldn't pick up any revenue. You probably might lose revenue. So, the idea of the cartel is this. If the demand curve for the firm is elastic, if the demand curve for the industry is quite inelastic, then if you can organize it, you can cut the production from here to here, raise the price in such a way that total revenue will increase. You can then parcel out the increase to the different firms. In other words, say you have 10 firms in the industry. If you get everybody to increase the price by 10%, you can cut, revenue will increase a lot, because then say sales only go down by 5% or something. You wind up with increased total revenue. If you can you can limit the supply, you can cut the supply, and you can parcel out the total revenue between the different firms. All the firms will be happy, except the consumers will be shafted. But to do this, you have to get an agreement. You have to make sure that all the firms cut. And if you're up here, there's always a temptation of each firm to undercut a secret price cut and capture an enormous amount of the market. Yes, that's the temptation of secret price cutting. Boy, if I can only cut making these enormous profits, you go way up here. If I can only cut my price by 10%, nobody else finds out about it, I can clean up. This temptation is enormous, and that's why every railroad will cut the price, and we get later to manufacturing, all the big cartel and merger agreements in the late 1890s, the same thing happened in manufacturing. Always undercut the price. A new firm will come in and reap the profits and all that. So at any rate, the idea is so what Jay Gould would do, he would buy a railroad and start going down his elastic demand curve and picking up all these great sales and making enormous profits. Boy, was he hated. It's very much like unionists hate strike breakers, call them scabs, because their unions are trying to raise the wage rate, keep other employees out. People they hate the most is not the employers, but the non-union people who take the jobs of the strikers. Same way, people in other manufacturers or other railroad people hate most of the other railroad men or other manufacturers who break the cartel agreement. That was Gould's function. He looked for a good high profit place. He figured out the high profits would do an agreement. He'd nip in there, buy the railroad, and undercut them. Magnificent. He was called the disturber of the peace. And, because he competed. And, his whole career was that of breaking rate agreements of this sort. He'd go in, he'd buy a railroad, undercut, smash the agreement, smash the cartel, and clean up. He did it when he was in charge of Union Pacific. He bought Union Pacific during the 1870s. Did it there. And of course, in the long run, he benefited the railroads because it meant that they had to compete. They had to lower their costs. If the price goes down, the price is cut. It means that they have to shape up, lower their costs, get rid of waste and that sort of stuff. But of course, they didn't like to be shaped up in that way, as you can imagine. And He was a great character, hated by everybody. The consumers didn't appreciate him either. They didn't understand what was going on. Of course, they liked the rate cuts, but they didn't understand that he was different from the other so-called robber barons. And you look at Gould, he's again a self-made man. He fit the image of Hill. He also Carnegie and Rockefeller later on. These people were all born with nothing. They had no capital. His parents were quite poor, born in upstate New York. He was short, 5 foot tall, Jay Gould, short and thin. Of course, everybody was shorter in that period, but that was unusually short. He didn't have an average of 5 foot. This is a height theory of history I keep coming up with here. He was self-taught. Of course, he didn't go to college. None of these guys went to college. By the way, it's another thing, the whole college nonsense. You didn't have in the United States in that period, very few people went to college. And the people didn't seem to suffer from not going to college. They started working at the age of 12 or whatever it was, and by the age of 20, they could be millionaires. The rest of the people were slogging away through college. I'm not knocking college per se. You have to realize there's another side of this picture. You waste a lot of time in college. He was a self-taught surveyor. He started as a railroad surveyor, and he started speculating. He was frail also. He was half dead most of the time. And he was a great corporate financier. He saw the rates, he started maneuvering with that. He plowed back profits. He was cool, detached, emotionless, all that sort of stuff. All the stereotypes that Jay Gould. He was a great guy. I love him. And he benefited consumers, he benefited the industry, and he made a lot of enemies along the way. God bless him. Anyway, yes, sir. Well, this is, I think I did this before too. The point is that every firm faces an elastic demand curve. Okay? Huh? Yeah, okay. Right. Right. Demand for the industry is less elastic, can be very inelastic. Depends on the conditions of the industry. Okay? But by the way, the demand curve here is simply price times quantity of total revenue. Okay? So if you cut the price, you have an elastic demand curve, the quantity will go up much more than the price fall, and you have an increased total revenue. If you have an inelastic demand curve, you cut the price, the total revenue will go down. Quantity only goes up a little bit. So what I'm saying is, if you have this very high price, a cartel price, each firm, they can cut the demand curve, they can make an enormous amount of money if they can go down their firm demand curve. In other words, if they can cut the price and the other guy doesn't find out about it, they can pick up an enormous amount of money, and they can do that for 6 months if they keep it quiet. It's just that eventually, of course, the competitors find out about it, and there's mutual recrimination and hatred, and the whole cartel goes bust. So that's essentially what it is. It's just a graph simply explaining that. Anyway, so this is the railroad commissions begin in the state level. They begin in the I think the first commission was Massachusetts, and the drive then comes for this national commission. The first bill, House bill, first bill submitted to Congress, was written by the attorney for one of the top railroads. Matter of fact, one of the things we'll see later with oil, the Standard Oil was getting a lot of discounts from railroads because they had a big oil business. And therefore, since they had a bigger quantity, they were getting bigger discounts. So a lot of the smaller oil companies wanted to have a railroad cartel in order to screw Standard Oil. So they got together with the railroad attorneys. Now, in Pennsylvania, you had a drive for railroad commissions, state railroad commissions, to raise the rate, to cartelize, with the railroads, of course, behind it, plus some of the smaller oil people who wanted to put the screws to Standard Oil. So that you had different interests on the part of the shippers, but the railroads almost unanimously in favor of a cartel. You had the 2 bills and 3 bills and all that, and a lot of jockeying for victory, etc. And finally, in 1887, they passed the Interstate Commerce Act, and which outlawed discrimination. The same thing as Fink had really proposed. It outlawed rebates. It had compulsory publicity. The whole bit. It didn't. It turned out it wasn't very. The enforcement procedures weren't super, but anyway, that was their first attempt. And they set up the Interstate Commerce Commission. One of the things the railroads didn't like is they outlawed cartels, pools, which were not part of the process of the commission. So railroads try to eliminate that. But basically, railroads all loved it. When the Interstate Commerce Bill was passed, 1887, the railroad magazines loved it. The Railroad Gazette, and the Railway Review, which are the two major railroad magazines, praised it highly, says it's great, so forth and so on. Then the question is, who should be a commissioner? Of course, if you have something like this, in order for the railroads to really run it, they had to control the commission in all these situations. And this, by the way, I might have said this before, but I'll repeat it. This is counter to the usual liberal, what we call the Ralph Nader myth. The Ralph Nader myth is that these commissions were originally in favor of lowering prices, lowering rates, and they were taken over by the industry later. They were dominated by the industry after 20 or 30 years, but originally had a golden age situation. Originally, these were pro-competition, anti-monopoly, a lot of nonsense. The bills were written by the railroads, lobbied for by the railroads, and staffed from the very beginning by the railroad interests. For example, by the way, the major person, the chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first commission, 1887, the distinguished Judge Thomas McIntyre Cooley, who was unfortunately pictured by most historians as being a great laissez-faire advocate. He might have been a laissez-faire advocate except in railroads. He was, of course, it's true he was a judge of the Michigan Supreme Court. He was Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. He was Dean of the University of Michigan Law School. He was also, however, a railroad pool member. He was a railroad pool arbitrator. He was so like Fink. He was one of Fink's, Fink was not the only professional railroad pool person. He was also Cooley. He was an old arbitrator, assistant to Fink in many of his pools. He was a railroad lawyer. And he was a very pro-cartel, pro-pool. Other members of the first ICC were one guy was an old Democratic Congress hack. He was unimportant, named Morrison. Another guy was Walter Bragg, who was formerly the Alabama Railroad Commission, in other words, an Alabama railroad cartelist. A guy named Schoonmaker, I guess you pronounce it, who was a former railroad attorney. And a guy named Walker was a railroad person, so much of a railroad person, he wound up, after he left the commission, he wound up as chairman of the board of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. It's one of the biggest railroads in the country. It connects up with the Southern Pacific. So anyway, big railroad person. This is a railroad-dominated commission. The whole commission were railroad people, from Cooley on down. And the idea was the ICC would not set rates directly. They would help the railroads to set the rates and outlaw discrimination and all the rest of it. So Cooley is one person to focus on. Another guy is one of my particular pet peeves, because I don't like the type, I guess. Charles Francis Adams Jr. was a Boston Brahmin, very distinguished member of the Adams family. Not an Indian Brahmin. The Bostonians are kind of an interesting group. They're all interconnected. It's an elite, power elite of people who are families, about half a dozen, maybe a dozen families, all been interconnected since the 17th century. The Lees, the Adams, the Higginsons, the Cabots, the Lodges, the Lowells. There was a famous jingle when I was growing up, something to the effect that Boston, the land of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God. And there's sort of that sort of attitude. Adams was the Adams family was always sneering at commerce and manufacturing being sort of low type and unaristocratic. Adams himself was a big advocate of cartels and railroad commissions. As a matter of fact, he said, when the Interstate Commerce Commission Act was passed, he said it should be rigidly and literally enforced. Every provision should be rigidly and literally enforced. He became the first Massachusetts Railroad Commissioner, and he then became, when the Interstate Commerce Act was passed, he was chairman of the board of Union Pacific Railroad. So here's a guy, you see, who was not only a pretend aristocrat, always bellyaching about the evils of commerce and industry. Here he is, head of the Union Pacific Railroad, and a big advocate, of course, as I say, of government-enforced cartels. The next question to ask is, how come oh, by the way, after the Interstate Commerce Act was passed, they still couldn't enforce. Then the Interstate Commerce Commission tried to establish the cartel through government action. They still weren't very successful at it. The railroad industry is so vast, they still were, Fink was still having his rates going busted. Even cartels were going busted, even with the government, even with the ICC enforcing Fink's pools, trying to enforce the rate. There'd still be competition. There'd still be rate busting. There'd still be new railroads coming in. And so the railroads kept calling for more and more enforcement. And over the years, they kept tightening the Interstate Commerce Act, the Hepburn Act, all these acts which try to improve the enforcement, increase the enforcement, and try to outlaw competition. So the market was still successful undercutting, even with the ICC, trying to use the power of the federal government to enforce Fink's quotas. It still wasn't very successful. But it was successful enough to sort of screw up the industry over the years. No question about that. The shippers finally said, well, gee, we're worse off now than before the act was passed. We find out rates are going up instead of going down. And they were euchred. They didn't understand the situation. The next question to ask here is, which we'll ask next time, how come the Interstate Commerce Act was passed during the first Democratic administration since the Civil War, the Cleveland administration? What you have to realize is that most historians used to talk about the period from 1865 to 1912 as being totally Republican dominated. It was not Republican dominated. It was very close. The elections were very close. In 1876, the Democrats really won the election. Samuel Tilden of New York really won the election. The election was stolen from them by fraud and euchre. So that Hayes wins by one electoral vote. Tilden won the election by far. As a matter of fact, the popular vote, Tilden had 4.3 million votes in 1976, and Hayes only had 4.0 million. And it was a big victory by Tilden, which was only taken away from by fraudulent means by various Reconstruction governments. And apparently what happened was that Hayes made a deal with the Southern Democrats. That some of the Southern Democrats would throw their vote to Hayes, provided the federal troops get out of the South. That was the end Reconstruction, get the federal troops out. So the Democrats really won the election of 1876. As a matter of fact, just give you a very quick popular vote here. The other elections were extremely close. Usually the Democrats had at least one house of Congress for this whole period. In 1876, this is a Republican, this is a Democrat. Hayes had 4.0 million votes, and Tilden had 4.3 million. In 1880, Garfield, who was the Republican victor, had 4.45 million votes, and Hancock, Democrat, at 4.44 million. It was almost tied. It was like 60,000 votes or something. Very, very close. In 1884, when Cleveland won, first Democrat to win, he had 4.9 million votes, and Blaine, known as the Continental Liar from the state of Maine, at 4.85 million, 4.91. Very, 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 very close elections. Anyway, Cleveland wins the first time, and Democrats are committed to laissez-faire, free trade, all the rest of it. How come the Interstate Commerce Act was passed and signed in the Democratic administration by Cleveland? How come Cleveland violated his own laissez-faire principles to agree to a railroad regulation? That's the next question we will look at next on Tuesday, namely the mystery of this, which will be solved, how it is that Cleveland, who was basically all of his life a laissez-faire person, how come he wimped out in this key area of railroad regulation? And there's a lesson to be learned by that. Why did Cleveland pass an Interstate Commerce Act, the first federal regulatory commission, when Cleveland was a laissez-faire Democrat, laissez-faire liberal? Cleveland was an interesting figure anyway. Cleveland was in many ways a heroic figure. First of all, he came from Buffalo. You have to realize that New York State, this is New York State, is that I talked about Yankee pietism in the first class or so, that the fanatical drive for stamping out sin and so forth and so on, which led to statism on the economic front, by Yankees, who later became the basic members of the Whig Party and then the Republican Party. Well, Yankees were settled from rural Massachusetts all the way out to Michigan and Wisconsin. But the heartland of Yankeedom, the real guts of Yankee land, was western New York, approximately from the Hudson Valley west of Buffalo. In other words, this whole area, which is the heart and soul of the Yankee pietism. It was called by the people then and by historians after that the burned-over district. There's a charming name for it. Burned over by repeated fires of religious fanaticism. You name it, and it started in western New York. The Mormon church, I don't want to attack Mormonism, but the Mormon church started in western New York. The Shakers started in western New York, the Oneida community people who are in favor of celibacy, and they found it difficult, therefore, to means in order to continue the movement, you have to have continual converts, that you can't reproduce anybody. They found it apparently in the long run difficult to sustain this. So this is the heartland of pietist fanaticism. Many of the leaders of the Republican Party and Whig Party came from western New York for that reason. Thurlow Weed, William Seward, etc., on and on and on. But here's Cleveland, comes from western New York. He's a Protestant from Buffalo. How does that fit in? The way it fits in is this. It's very interesting. Cleveland was an old-school Presbyterian. In other words, he was part of a small minority of the Presbyterian Church and the Congregationalist Church and other Protestant churches, which resisted and were very much opposed to the pietist, revivalist kind of evangelical framework. He was an old-style Calvinist, even obeying, in that sense, he was very much like Catholics and Lutherans, in the sense he's in favor of obeying church law. The way to get saved, if you can get saved, which you know Calvinism is kind of difficult anyway, the way to get saved is you join the church, you obey the law, and that's it, obey the church law. So you don't worry about being born again and all the other stuff. You don't worry about compulsory stamping out of sin. All that stuff is anathema to old-style Calvinists as it is to Catholics and Lutherans. And even to this day, I have friends of mine who are old-style Calvinists and take exactly the same position. So Cleveland was an old-style Calvinist, and therefore was in the Democratic Party. And the thing is, he stamped his mark on the Democratic Party. He ran for president and won in 1884, the first Democrat since the Civil War, which is a big thing. He ran for president in 88 and just lost by a fraction. He got his vote, maybe I mentioned this already, his vote was 5.54 million in 1888. And Benjamin Harrison, Republican from Indiana, who defeated him, vote was 5.544 million. In other words, Cleveland won on the popular vote and lost in the Electoral College. And in 1892, he wins again on a relative landslide. So Cleveland was the leader of the Democratic Party now for many years. And so, as a matter of fact, when Charles Beard wrote an excellent book, now forgotten, he was a very good historian, wrote a book in World War II called The Republic, a charming book, a sort of a pattern after Plato's Republic, with 3 guys or 4 guys sit around and discuss political philosophy for the whole book. It's very, very well done. And the guy who represents for Beard, laissez-faire, libertarian type Democrat was Cleveland. They called him a Cleveland Democrat, old-fashioned Cleveland Democrat. This is 1944. So Cleveland put his mark. He was the leader of the laissez-faire wing of the Democratic Party. So the mystery becomes even greater. Why did Cleveland then, and what he was in favor of, and put through in his administration, the first federal regulatory commission for railroads? And so that sets the stage of the problem. Well, the basic answer is this. Cleveland, well, first, yeah.
In Cleveland, the root of Blaine.
Yes, no, he beat Blaine in 1884. He beat Blaine. Now, in 1876, Tilden, the Democrat, ran and beat Hayes, but got the election stolen in the Electoral College.
And Cleveland beat Blaine.
Cleveland beat Blaine in 1884. So Cleveland was the first Democrat to become president since the Civil War. Well, it wasn't a complete Democratic era. It was a very closely knit. It was almost tied. But the point is that Cleveland was essentially the major figure in the Democratic Party for many years, for like 20 years or so. Tilden, who was Cleveland's mentor, and was a New York Democrat who really should have won, and really did win in 1876. He was from New York City. Question is, Tilden was also a laissez-faire Democrat, but Tilden was above all things a railroad lawyer. He's probably the most distinguished, most highly paid railroad lawyer in the country. We also have to realize that one of the things that happens, I'll mention later on today about the rise of manufacturing and industry after the Civil War period. But one of the things that happened was the rise of corporate law, because lawyers before the Civil War were really, I mean, everybody was a lawyer in politics. They didn't make much money. For example, the highest paid lawyer, the highest income lawyer before the Civil War was Daniel Webster, by far the highest paid. He made about $20,000 a year, or $25,000 a year. That was the highest paid lawyer. In current terms, if you multiply that by 7 or 8, it means he's making about $840,000 a year, which is, you know, it's not bad, but it's not a top lawyer salary, obviously. He was the top lawyer. After the Civil War, so it was $20,000 a year top. After the Civil War, lawyers were making much more. In other words, corporate law then comes in because corporations come in. Railroads were the big corporation; they were coming in, and so top lawyers were essentially railroad lawyers, and so the top lawyers were making about $200,000 a year, which in our terms is like $1 million a year, which is damn good, to say the least. So this is the whole profession of corporate law becomes a very important one. In other words, before that, most lawyers were trial lawyers. You know, they defended people and that sort of stuff. Since there were no corporations, there wasn't much corporate law. There were very few corporations, banks and canals. So we have Tilden as a railroad lawyer, and railroads, of course, were mostly in favor of this kind of government regulation, in favor of this new system of cartelization. In particular, in favor of a new system was J.P. Morgan and Company. I already mentioned becomes the big investment banker and a big railroad banker, certainly after the Panic of 1873. The Cleveland administration, from top to bottom, including Cleveland, were very heavily tied in with railroads and with Morgan, railroads in general, and Morgan specifically. And so what we have then is with Morgan beginning to dominate the Democratic Party, especially in the higher reaches, in the top elite reaches, he begins to be able to shift their attitude toward railroad cartelization, government interference in railroads and government cartelization. Cleveland himself, before he became mayor of Buffalo, in other words, when he was in the private sector, was a railroad lawyer. His partner was one of his major partners was Francis Lynn Stetson, whom I'll appeal a lot in this course, time to time, who, when Cleveland, after Cleveland leaves the presidency finally in 1896, he then joined Stetson again. And Stetson was the top Morgan lawyer. In other words, he was J.P. Morgan's personal lawyer. He was his partner of a law firm. It was J.P. Morgan and Company's lawyer. So he was sort of the top Morgan lawyer. Also, one of Cleveland's major clients was New York Central Railroad, which was the largest railroad in New York State, and also originally owned by Commodore Vanderbilt, a very famous character, interesting character himself, but who then was more or less taken over by Morgan. So you have essentially Vanderbilt - Morgan. So in later years, Morgan essentially runs it in an alliance with the Vanderbilt family. So you have, so Cleveland himself then is essentially a Morgan railroad lawyer type person, which accounts, you see, very neatly for his deviation from laissez-faire in this particular key area, his shift to so-called progressive, what you want to call it, compulsory cartelization of government. And let's look at the rest of the Cleveland cabinet. Cleveland comes in and has a cabinet. Okay, you have the whole cabinet, almost the whole cabinet is either a Morgan cabinet or very closely allied. Secretary of State was Thomas Bayard. There were several, of course, during the years, but the major of Delaware, Senator of Delaware. Bayard was essentially, he came from an old aristocratic family in Delaware, but he essentially was a disciple and tool almost of August Belmont. To such an extent, Belmont was a German investment banker who was an agent of Rothschild Company, which is the most famous investment bank in France, Britain, and Germany, with international investment bankers. Belmont came to New York his name was Schoenberg, and came to New York as a Rothschild agent, and continued to be a Rothschild agent all of his life, even though he himself, of course, became a millionaire on his own. He, of course, is the founder of Belmont Racetrack and all the rest of the Belmont family. Anyway, Bayard was virtually a tool of Belmont. Belmont's son, Perry Belmont, not only was Bayard's main administrative assistant for many years, he also lived in his house and was sort of like a close buddy, secretary, and I guess we now call him his control in espionage terms. At any rate, so Belmont was the secretary-treasurer of the National Democratic Party for decades, like for 40 years. So, and Morgans and Rothschilds were quite close. They weren't always close, but they were basically an alliance. So again, you have the Rothschild wing, so to speak, of an investment banker grouping here. So that's the Secretary of State under Cleveland. Secretary of Treasury, first person Secretary of Treasury, a guy named Daniel Manning. This, of course, is his key post. And Manning was a close friend of Tilden, sort of one of his top lieutenants. Tilden was still around. Tilden was sort of like elder statesman of the New York Democratic Party, and also a lawyer and director of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, which not only was a Morgan-type railroad, also had J.P. Morgan himself on the board of directors, which showed that it was very intimately Morgan-oriented. So once again, we can put parenthesis Morgan around the name of Daniel Manning. He got ill after a year or two and resigned. His top assistant then takes over as Secretary of the Treasury, and that was a guy named Charles Fairchild. Again, a wealthy family here. And see, one cabinet member or one president could be an accident, but if you have the whole cabinet as Morgan-oriented, you begin to see that there's a pattern here which can't be denied. At any rate, Charles Fairchild was Attorney General of New York. Before that, he was a disciple of Tilden, once again, and in the Tilden machine, so to speak. He married the niece of Henry Seymour, who had run for president in 1868 in New York. And his father, Sidney Fairchild, was on the board of directors of Erie and Pittsburgh Railroad, and also attorney chief counsel of the New York Central Railroad. In other words, this guy's father was the chief counsel of New York Central, which was Morgan. You have these patterns which cannot be an accident. It can't be a coincidence where the whole damn gang becomes a Morgan, tightly in with a Morgan ambit. The Attorney General, a guy named Garland of Arkansas, was a railroad director. Secretary of War, in other words, there was no Secretary of Defense in those days. It was the War Department, frankly called the War Department. The name Defense Department only comes in after World War II as a euphemism. Anyway, Secretary of War, essentially was the Army. There was a Secretary of War those days and a Secretary of the Navy, which took care of the Navy. This guy's name was William Endicott. Of course, the very name Endicott means that he's a Boston Brahmin type. And indeed he was. Boston patrician, lawyer, former judge. And the guy who almost was the first choice, almost got the post, was John Quincy Adams Jr., of course, another Boston Brahmin, member of the Adams family, son of the former president. He was urged upon Cleveland to pick this guy by Francis Lynn Stetson, his former law partner and Morgan lawyer. And he was very much connected with the Boston financial elite. In particular, his wife, always have to look at the wife connections in these people too. His wife was one of the Peabody, I guess it's pronounced, family. A very distinguished Boston family. The head of whom, George Peabody, I guess it was the uncle, I think. Anyway, George Peabody, who was the head of a banking firm which had as a partner J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Morgan, the British banker. Okay? It's always very good to have a partner who's either Morgan himself or his father. It's good for your career. Okay, so his partner was Morgan's father. And also, one of the Peabodys, another uncle, was the best man at J.P. Morgan's wedding. It's also good to have been the best man at Morgan's wedding. Also very good. Another thing you have to realize about the whole Boston financial group after about 1870, from then on until the present day, almost I would say, Boston, first of all, they're all interconnected, the whole Boston group. The Lees, the Higginsons, the Lowells, the Cabots, the Lodges, the Adamses, this whole group become connected through First Boston Corporation, which is another big bank, to the Morgans. In other words, it got to the point where Morgan equaled, in Boston they were the Morgan people. And this, I think, still I'm not sure what's going on now, but certainly at least until World War II, the Boston Financial Group, you explain Henry Cabot Lodge equals Morgan. In other words, so that was part of the whole equation, which we'll see later on, becomes important. Secretary of the Navy was the guy who really had it made. A member of the Whitney family, which has the Whitney Museum here and things like that. And they have to realize the Navy in those days was more important than the Army because the Navy was permanent. The Army only comes in during wartime. So, William C. Whitney, Secretary of the Navy, close friend and disciple of Tilden politically, once again, comes from New York. And not only close friend of Cleveland, but also Cleveland's campaign manager during the campaign. A big railroad board, member of the board of directors of two railroads in New York, both of which were Vanderbilt. And therefore connected with the Morgans. It's really Morgan-Vanderbilt now. So this is important, maybe today. There's also the son-in-law Whitney of Harry Payne, Henry B. Payne. That's why there are people right now, whose name is Payne Whitney. Okay, connected to the two mighty families. And Henry Payne was director of about four Vanderbilt railroads. Okay, but his brother, Oliver Payne, was a director, officer all of his life for Standard Oil in New Jersey. Standard Oil, of course, being the big Rockefeller. As we'll see later, I think today, I hope, Rockefeller family essentially dominated the Republican Party from about 1876 until probably until now, or at least until the 1960s. At any rate, so here's the two mighty, titanic, competing financial forces in the United States. The Morgans who essentially run the Democratic Party, the Rockefellers essentially run the Republican Party. Here's this guy, the whole Payne Whitney are in with both camps. That's a very good thing to be. To be both in with the Morgans and be a relative of the Rockefellers. Can't hurt. By relative, I mean relative of somebody who's family of connected with the Rockefellers. Rockefellers, as we'll see later, have a whole group of families who have invested with them since 1870. The same group until right now. The Bedfords, the Pratts, there's a whole bunch of the Harknesses, et cetera, all of whom act with the Rockefellers and invest with them, which of course makes the Rockefeller power much greater than just one family, of course. Secretary of the Interior, which is very important because the Interior ran the whole public land system, of course still does, was a guy from Mississippi who happened to be a top railroad lawyer, which usually means Morgan. And then another guy from Wisconsin, actually was a great guy, who had been Postmaster General, who was a Vanderbilt Morgan railroad lawyer. So, and the attorney for the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which was Vanderbilt. So you have the whole cabinet. I think, the whole cabinet was connected with the Morgans. Also the ambassador to Great Britain, which is always a top post. Ambassador to the Court of St. James was a Vermont guy who was the chairman of a railroad, which was Vanderbilt. And also, afterward, he resigns. Another guy comes in who's the chairman of the board of the New York Central, which of course is Vanderbilt Morgan. The ambassador to France, in those days minister to France, the second most important post in the diplomatic service, was a guy named McLean, whose father was the president of Baltimore, Ohio Railroad, which is also in with the Morgans. So the whole cabinet, the whole damn cabinet, in those days of course cabinet was much smaller than now. The whole cabinet was a Morgan cabinet. or Morgan Vanderbilt cabinet. The exception of the Secretary of State, who was a Rothschild person. But closely allied, of course. So there we have our answer. I think the second administration of Cleveland was very similar. You don't have to go into that. As a matter of fact, by the way, it's an interesting thing about Stetson, was the top, as I mentioned before, the top Morgan lawyer. His law firm, which was cool in those days, I think Stetson Jennings and something or other. You know, law firms are never corporations. They're always partnerships. They can the names keep changing as new guys come in. This is the same law firm, which is now Davis, Polk & Wardwell, which is probably still one of the top Morgan law firms right now. So it's like 100 years later. We have a continuity in this, by the way, to leap ahead a little bit to show you what's happening in American politics. In 1924, okay, Calvin Coolidge runs for president, runs for re-election. He come in because Harding died in office. Harding, by the way, was an Ohio Republican and therefore a Rockefeller person. Coolidge was a Boston-type person and tied him with a Morgan, therefore tied him with a Morgan. And this is always usually happens in American politics. You have two factions in the party, whatever the party is. The winning faction gets the presidency, and the losing faction gets the vice presidency. It's continuing on to Kennedy Johnson. So if you have Harding, who was an Ohio Republican, as we'll see in a minute, or therefore a Rockefeller Republican, was President. Coolidge was from Massachusetts, and therefore, and was connected personally also with the Boston Financial Group, and therefore Morgan. Rockefeller dies. Okay? Coolidge becomes president. In 1924, Coolidge runs again for president, for re-election, on the Republican ticket. The Democrats pick after 103 ballots, the titanic struggle for power, which we'll get to later on in the course, I hope, emerging as a dark horse after the 102nd ballot. I mean, nowadays you have, usually somebody wins on the first ballot, you understand. In my living memory, Wendell Willkie, I think, won on the 8th ballot. That's about the longest I can think of. 103 ballots, that's been magnificent. Anyway, so on 103rd, 104th ballot, Davis emerges, John W. Davis is Democrat president, head of the top Morgan law firm, Morgan's personal lawyer. You have a Morgan guy running for a Republican ticket and a Morgan guy running a Democratic ticket. The Morgan, of course, is Morgan Heaven, 1924. Really, he controlled both presidential nominations. All right, so this is the reason I've now answered the question why it is that Cleveland deviated from laissez-faire on this one crucial point, namely railroad regulation. Is because he was a Morgan railroad lawyer, and his whole cabinet reflected this Morgan influence. Morgan gets increasingly, by the way, status as time goes on. But what happens is, to leap ahead a little bit, the Morgans decided in the late 1890s when manufacturing begins to incorporate. Manufacturing was partnerships until the 1890s. None of these outfits were really corporations. When they begin to incorporate and become much larger in the 1890s, they try to achieve monopoly prices through mergers on the free market. They can't do it. They lose out. And then they shift. The Morgans then shift to a general status program, not just for railroads, for the whole United States economy. They become progressives, quote unquote, or general status. That's by around 1900. So anyway, and then the whole, of course, party shifts along with them. Okay, the next step is to show the rise of, after the Civil War, especially as time goes on, of manufacturing, a big business, not just in railroads, but in manufacturing in general. There are various statistics for this. There's GNP statistics. One way to look at it is, this is statistics, value added by selected industries. Right? You look at, and this is constant prices, 1879 prices, there was eliminated price changes. In those days, of course, prices were falling every year. It was magnificent. A value added by different industries. Right? 1869, agriculture was $1.7 billion. 1899, it was $3.9 billion. This is, I'm saying, constant dollars. You can forget about inflation or deflation. So it's about more than double. In other words, it reflects real output. more or less. I mean, it's not precise, but it gives you an idea. Mining goes up from 0.07 billion to 0.55, so eightfold increase. This is more than double. This is an eightfold increase. Construction goes up from 0.4 billion to 1.0. It's like two and a half fold. And manufacturing goes up from 1.1 to 6.3, basically a six-fold increase in these 30 years. That's one way of looking, one gauge, one way of looking at it. Pig iron, and now we're looking at physical units. Pig iron went up from, this is basically our industrial revolution, so to speak. Pig iron goes up from 1848. These are pig iron shipments, thousands of short tons. Pig iron goes up from 900,000 short tons, 1848. 1865 was 930, not much difference. And 1899, 15,250,000, over 15.2 million. Enormous increase, approximately 16-fold increase. No, there's no inflation. I'm correcting. Actually, those days it was deflation. Prices were going down in this period. Correcting for price change. It was a magnificent period. I'll get to that a little bit later. But prices were falling throughout, all the way from 1865 to 1896. It was magnificent. Imagine waking up in the morning and knowing in your heart and your gut that next year prices will be 3% less. The savings savings are encouraged. People don't have to worry about the dollar being wiped out. But salary remained about the same in money terms, and the prices kept falling. The real income kept going up. And the salary stayed the same per age of the person. And then, as prices, of course, of living kept going down, real wages went up. It was great. Marvelous period to live in. Of course, there was no air conditioning then, but we can't have everything. Steel ingots and castings and other. Steel, of course, really starts with the Civil War period, so around there. So steel ingots and castings produced. In 1867, 20,000 long tons. Some of these things are measured in short tons and some in long. I don't know exactly why, but anyway, it doesn't make any difference. 20,000. 1899, it was 10.6 million. So that's about 500-fold increase of steel ingots. There's an index of physical production, very difficult. Physical manufacturing production is very tricky, and you can't really do it very well, but essentially went up by about six-fold in this period. With steel ingots, again, most of it, one of the things this reflects is there was a change in technology of steel. In 1867, most of the steel was crucible steel, which is apparently high quality, but you can't make much of it. Crucible, which was about 17,000 tons. A little bit of Bessemer, but Bessemer just coming in then. Starts in Europe. It's 2.7. Bessemer, I think, is a product. Don't ask me in any detail. Bessemer is probably forced hot air and forced oxygen in, I think, at high temperatures, which makes it more malleable. And so, by 1899, crucible goes up to 101.2 thousand. Bessemer is 7.6 million. And this is all in thousands. This is 1.6 million. And coming up fast on the outside is open hearth steel, which comes in, which starts about 1870 and was zero in 1867. Open hearth is even hotter. injections or whatever, and then it's 3.0 million. It passes Bessemer by about 1905 or something like that. Open hearth then becomes the key steel, and remains the key steel thing until 1930s or something. With was it oxygen something? What's it called? Huh? It's called oxygen converter. What's the name of that? Oxygen conversion or something. That again starts. Yeah, something like that. Oxygen conversion or something. We'll see later that U.S. Steel, which was supposed to be a monopoly, designed as a monopoly in steel, is the last company to introduce any of these things. The last corporation in the world in steel have introduced this current process. They've always been a flopperoo. Okay, so Bessemer, let's say, rules the roost until about 1906, when open hearth essentially takes over. 1908. And then rolled iron steel comes in, something again new, which didn't exist in 1867. Rolled iron and steel. Contrast to casting and ingots. So it's zero in 1867, and then by 1885 it's 3.1 million tons, and by 1899 it's about 10.3 million. So it's coming out very fast. It's in addition to all the other stuff. This is rolled iron steel. So enormous increase in iron steel production. Where were we using it? All over the place. There were, railways, steel rails, and manufacturing, all sorts of other things. I mean, it's just the basic thing. Elements for machines in general, for all sorts of stuff. You name it. Well, no, this is just an indication of what was going on. As I'm showing the tremendous increase in production. I mean, just taking different industries. This is an example, an illustration of what's going on. Tremendous flowering of production all over the place. Manufacturing, size of the factory comes in. I'll mention this in a minute. Factories really come in this period. They didn't really exist before much, except in arms manufacturing. So, I mean, the whole thing, just an explosion of, and they all fit together. Rails produced. Steel rails go up about sixfold. In 1867, they were about 4,500 tons. In 1899, it was 2.3 million tons. And this is a period, by the way, when there wasn't much increase in railway mileage by this time, but there's still tremendous outpouring of rails. So this is about 415,000. So it goes up by about sixfold. Structural iron and steel goes in a lot, increased by about tenfold. Bricks go up by about threefold. Cotton textiles increased by about fivefold. Coal increased by 14 times. And crude oil, of course, increased by about 19 times. We'll get to crude oil in a minute. That's a big new industry. The whole oil industry is virtually brand new. Crude oil increases from 1867. It really begins in 1859. The first oil well dug Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1859. 1867, 3.3 million barrels. That's a big increase, of course, from zero. 1999 is 57.1 million barrels, a 19-fold increase. Most of these processes, Bessemer begins in England. The open hearth process begins in Germany. Siemens Martin process. Essentially, the United States, however, is the greatest increase in these things when the Industrial Revolution really takes off. Iron begins to tap. The Minnesota iron mines begin to come into production, and the Sabi Iron Range in the Great Lake, Minnesota area comes into production. Coal starts in Pennsylvania and spreads to Illinois, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And crude oils, we'll see, begins in Pennsylvania, continues there, and spreads to Ohio and Indiana. So, also, before the Civil War, most of the power in industry was water power. That's how you got the power. And, of course, in water power, water power wasn't that bad. We had to situate near some kind of waterfall. Okay? So it's kind of limited location. And for example, a lot of you go up to New England, you see lots of these circular what do they call these damn things? Maybe a turbine or whatever. You know, the water goes over it and produces power. Steam comes in after the Civil War and takes over. And one of the great things about steam is you don't have to worry about being near a waterfall. You can be any place. So you can locate near markets. You can locate near a fuel supply. You're not stuck with finding New England, of course, has a lot of streams and waterfalls. So it was, you know, but other places it's very difficult to find one. Steam turbine comes in, etc., etc. Factory comes in, as I mentioned a little bit. Before the Civil War, basically, there were no factories. What happens is you have a capitalist who buys, invests, saves up and invests in material, raw material, say cotton textiles. He invests in material, and he finds weavers, knitters and weavers, and he hires them, usually on a piecework basis, to produce this stuff, and then he gets it and, you know, sells it down the line. The weavers and men have to have their own equipment. You have your own loom in the basement or whatever. The basement is the ground floor. And so this obviously limits production. You have it's called a putting out system, or a domestic system. Where the merchant essentially saves up and invests in this thing, but the workers own their equipment. There was no, quote, alienation, unquote, of workers from that capital. They have to own their equipment. That's a big problem. In other words, if you're a weaver, you have to own your loom. It means you have to have a lot of money to buy the loom or build it or wherever you get it. Putting out system. So after the Civil War, a factory comes in. We bring the workers together into one spot, and you have a continuous flow of some sort of equipment. You have the machines together. The capitalist owns the machine. The worker doesn't have to invest in a machine. This is a big thing. It's a big benefit to the worker. It means anybody can get a job. You don't have to own a loom or whatever else. You don't have to own iron forging equipment or whatever it happens to be. So a factory has been defined. I guess it's a pretty good definition. As a place where, quote, raw material can be converted into finished goods by consecutive harmonious processes carried along by a central power, means some kind of power source. So that was the growth of the factory system, and meant, of course, an enormous increase in productivity and how many goods could be produced coming out of the factories, and a whole bunch of people, each one with a loom. Of course, it meant you had a supervisor employees, you have buildings where everybody gets together, you had machines located down in the same spot. You have much larger aggregations of capital equipment than you could have before that. And it means, I say, the worker doesn't have to save up the money to buy his own loom. You can then have a central location system. By the way, one interesting thing is that anti-capitalist types, leftists and so forth, have been bellyaching about the factory system for about 150 years. That this alienates the people from their labor. The good old days, you used to work at home, like on a farm. You work at home, family works at home, and now the father or husband or something is yanked away from his beloved hearth and has to go to the workplace and works in the factory and is alienated and so forth and so on. Well, now we have a situation, now with very high tech, and more of a situation where people can work at home, as you know, with computers and so forth. And so now they're bellyaching again, the leftists, the anti-capitalist side. Now they don't talk about alienation anymore. They stop bellyaching. This is a terrible thing that they can be exploited when they're at home. This happened with the beloved knitting cap ladies of Vermont, I think they were, a few years ago. Apparently Vermont, I forget if it was Vermont or New Hampshire. Anyway, a whole bunch of ladies who sit at home and knit ski caps and sweaters and stuff like that. No, I think ski caps. And they were happily, knitting away. It was great shape. They were making money they couldn't have made before. They could work at home. They didn't have to have babysitters and that sort of stuff. So, however, it violated the Department of Labor regulations. You can't have homework. Homework is illegal for most occupations. This was put in by the labor unions in the 30s. Because if somebody who's working at home is not going to join a union, obviously. It's very rare for a homework person to join some damn union. So the unions have a law passed to outlaw homework. And when the Department of Labor a few years ago found out, I think it was the Carter administration, found out that these people were illegal, they cracked down. They said, you can't do any ski cap knitting anymore. There's a lot of complaints. But pictures of these lovable middle-aged ladies now deprived of their homework. And they were getting, and the unions were claiming they were being exploited at getting below the minimum wage. It turned out they weren't getting below the minimum wage, but they were exploited under evil conditions. Of course, they didn't think their homes were evil working conditions. Their homes were pretty good shape. So in general, this the agitation, the result was the Reagan administration came in, what they did is they passed a law saying, I think they say that ski cap knitting was, outerwear ski cap knitting or something was legal, but nothing else. In other words, sweaters are still illegal, knitting sweaters at home. Everything else is illegal, just ski caps and some other thing. Some other subcategory is now legal. I hope it's not illegal. I think they probably drove that through after the Titanic struggle. So anyway, so they don't talk anymore about alienation, how great it is to work at home. Now they're complaining. As a matter of fact, now you have a situation like computer types in Long Island are working at home, and people are going to complain because they have visitors, they have traffic blocking the roads and stuff like that. It's a constant struggle. They violate zoning laws. We're not supposed to do anything at home. And the whole big nonsense involved with this. Shrinks often stay at home, and they try to outlaw that. The whole goes on and on. So anyway, somehow homework, even though allegedly beloved by statist, leftist types, when it didn't exist much, now that it can exist and does much more, now they're bellyaching about that too. Okay, corporations come in first, let's say, for railroads, and next for manufacturing, but much later. I mean, for example, Standard Oil was a partnership until quite late, and so was almost all the other companies. Corporations, the advantage of the corporate form over partnerships, okay, several obvious advantages. First of all, the corporate form is permanent. In other words, you have a bunch of people, they all, yeah. Deflation? Well, yeah, only in the sense that there was no worry about inflation. There's no worry about the dollar. With deflation? Yeah. Right. Prices go down, right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Your real income goes up. Well, that's. I don't think deflation creates the situation. Just the deflation permits productivity to lower prices. In other words, it works the other way around. You have an increase in productivity, savings, investment, and this increases the supply of goods. In other words, like curve shifts to the right. Prices go down. This increases everybody's real income in terms of purchasing power, so they can invest more and spend more. So, yeah, sure. Well, okay, I wouldn't say deflation in the sense of just. In other words, the causal force factor is you have an increase of. You don't have any much monetary inflation, so you permit the price to fall. This increases everybody's real income. Yeah, that's that. Yeah. Right. In other words, not that somehow it's good to have deflation per se. It's just good when it's caused by increasing productivity. And allows everybody to have increased real income. Right? Because naturally, when you have inflation, a lot of people have decreased real income because their wages don't catch up with prices. But they don't have that problem here because prices don't really go up. So, okay, let's take a 10-minute break or so, and then we'll be corporation for enabled to acquire large amounts of capital. First place, this is sort of not the rank order, it's different advantages. One is permanent. In other words, if you have a partnership, you and your brother-in-law and your friends or whatever, when one partner dies, it's a big headache. You usually have to reorganize the partnership and redistribute the assets and stuff like that. Corporation is permanent. If one stockholder dies, nobody cares because the entity itself just continues on with other stockholders. Second of all, this is part of the whole picture, you can transfer your stock. In other words, transferability of ownership. In other words, if you have a corporation with 1 million shareholders, let's say you have a $10 million corporation with $10 million in assets, and you have 1 million shareholders. So that means if you own one share, you essentially own one tenth of the. One share means you're owning 1/10. Yeah, right. Was the 1 millionth. 1/10 millionth? 1/10 millionth, right? Wait a minute. 1 millionth. 1 millionth. Sorry. Okay. You own 1 millionth. of the corporation. So if you own the whole million shares, you own the whole ball of wax. So each share is worth $10, let's say. So a share would be $10. And if you own one share, you own one millionth of the corporation. So you can, and the thing is, you can sell your share. In other words, if you're a partner, if there are 4 partners in this firm, you can't sell your share. I mean, you're sort of stuck. You have to, you can ask your partners to buy you out, but sometimes they don't want to buy you out, and then you're stuck. So if you have transferability, very important. You're liquid. In other words, you can sell out tomorrow. If I have 10 shares of IBM, I want to sell it tomorrow, I can do it like that. I don't have to wait, negotiate with somebody, et cetera, et cetera. So this means if you know that you can transfer ownership whenever you want, you're much more likely to invest in the corporation, obviously, because it's it's sort of a lifetime commitment to be a partner in some firm. And 3, the stockholder is only liable for the assets that's in the corporation. In other words, limited liability, as it's called. So in the case of, if you own, in other words, $10 worth of General Motors, whatever it is, if General Motors goes bankrupt, you lose your $10. Let's say you lose the whole thing. You usually don't because they can resell it and whatever. But anyway, let's assume the whole corporation disappears. It just goes bluey. All you lose is $10. In other words, the maximum you can lose is $10 million of the total assets. But if you're a personal liability, if you're a partnership, you can lose all your personal assets. In other words, if you're a partnership, you owe $1 million. And you liquidate, you go bankrupt, and you can only raise $100,000, you're liable for the other $900,000, you're going to have to sell your house and whatever. I mean, usually bankruptcy law is limited, but the point is, your personal assets are involved, where personal assets are never at risk in the corporation. Now you can say, isn't this, and there are many arguments about this. Many libertarians or free market types argue that corporations are immoral because the government limits the liability. In other words, this is an artificial limiting. It's a subsidy of the corporation. That was the argument. I don't think the argument is correct because the thing is, when you're a corporation, you put your creditors on notice. In other words, essentially, if you want to lend money to General Motors or IBM, or if you're a worker and you're waiting for money, if you buy a bond or whatever the loan happens to be, you know that the stockholders are limited liability, and you take that risk. So it isn't as if the government suddenly interferes and says, no, you can't attach the personal assets of whoever owns the corporation. You know that at the beginning, you take that chance. So I do not consider that a subsidy. The only subsidy that comes in here is when a corporation commits a tort. In other words, a tort is when a corporation somehow injures some person or whatever, third-party injury. In other words, where the person doesn't contract for it. I don't know what the truck of a corporation kills somebody, whatever, or pollution or something, or a nuclear accident. Now these things, of course, are tort, and therefore you can't contract a limited liability. The corporation has a limited liability for tort. That is a subsidy because it's not part of a contract where the creditor agrees to it. Because if you're a third party, a victim of a corporation in one way or the other, you haven't agreed to any limitation of liability. Outside of that, and this doesn't happen very often, a corporation is perfectly legitimate from the point of view of the free market or a libertarian legal structure. Anyway, the existence of the corporation means that you can acquire a vast amount of capital. Somebody's willing to invest because they know they can sell their shares at any time and so forth and so on. It's a tremendous advantage to the company, to the investor. And enable an enormous amount of growth in of course, in manufacturing and in railroad corporations. Another thing that comes in after the Civil War, almost from nothing, was the whole concept of insurance. Insurance really begins after the Civil War period, more or less. And it keeps growing until this day. Life insurance, accident insurance, a whole bunch of stuff. Assets keep growing. Now, the thing about insurance companies, for example, to give you an idea of the tremendous increase, in 1860, the total assets of life insurance companies, which has been a major pile-up of insurance, we'll see, total assets of $24 million of all life insurance in the United States. By 1897, total assets were $1.35 billion. And it's been growing almost at this rate since then. An enormous increase in capital. Now, the reason, and they invested in railroads and stuff. Now, the thing is that life insurance is a very peculiar industry, much more peculiar than accident insurance or fire insurance. The principles of insurance are, say, with fire or accident, essentially you're pooling risks. Let's say there are 1,000 buildings in some town, and you're worried about fire, and so you pool your risks. And statistically, if you have a large number like that, you can pretty well predict that one building will burn down, let's say, in a year, or two buildings, whatever it happens to be. So everybody pools their risks. They all contribute a certain amount of premiums, and then when one building burns down, they pay off the guy who suffered this loss. And they can calculate it fairly neatly, precisely, an actuarial basis. So that if you know that one building will turn out, and the building is worth, say, $100,000, you pool all these buildings, you get together, and you charge the premiums which more or less fit this competitively. You wind up, you pay the guy off, and that's it. There's no amassment of capital. Assets don't. There's no big capital investment. It's just you're pooling risk, and you pay off the guys, the losers. So this kind of insurance, fire insurance, accident insurance, doesn't pile up capital. It's no great advantage to any group of financial interests to control it, because who cares? I mean, you just, in a sense, in a pure sense, the assets disappear at the end of the year. You pile up 100,000. Each guy let's say there are 10 people. Each one contributes a certain amount of money, or let's say 100 people. Each contributes $1,000 a year premium. They collect the $100,000. They pay off one guy a year $100,000. They don't have any assets at all, except a little bit of salary or something. So there's no reason for insurance companies to become big financial plums, so to speak. Now, first with insurance, by the way, another thing about insurance, the thing which screws up insurance is when the loser, how should we put this? The loser creates his own loss. In other words, you have to assume these are acts of God or nature. In New York, for example, there's an old tradition of burning down, if you're losing money on a store, let's say you burn down the store and collect the fire insurance. You're not supposed to do that. It's obviously illegal because you're defrauding the insurance company. You're not supposed to be paying for somebody who consciously burns down something. You're only paying for an accidental fire, obviously. So setting your own fire for your so-called loss is obviously a no-no. In life insurance, the whole life insurance system is different from all the rest of it. Life insurance is a very peculiar industry because in life insurance, with so-called term insurance, is more or less like this. In other words, you can tell more or less how many people will die in each age group in the United States every year. And then people pool their resources, they can set premiums in such a way they pay off the people. With term insurance, you don't build up a large amount of capital. But the way life insurance has functioned mostly in the United States is so-called whole life insurance, where you pile up enormous amount, you charge much more than the competitive rate, you pile up an enormous amount of capital which sort of sits there until somebody dies. As a result of this, you're essentially paying double. In other words, you're amassing, it becomes sort of a capital investment industry where the policyholder doesn't really benefit. In other words, he still pays a high premium, and the insurance company has an enormous amount of capital which they can use to lower increase their profits, so their amount of capital amassed. The reason why this is allowed to take place is because, as we see with the progressive period, in addition to everything else, they cartelized the insurance industry and outlawed so-called racketeering insurance. In other words, insurance where they charge a low rate. You have to have licenses. It's a very heavily regulated industry for each state. As a result, the whole thing becomes a quasi-racket where you have a monopolized or cartelized industry, which then, when they charge a very high premium. Now whole life has become more or less discredited. They're getting away from that because people obviously lose a lot of money. If you start at the age of 21 or something and keep pouring in premiums and you wind up by about 40 or something, you're really paying the insurance companies. In other words, what you should really do if you have a whole life policy is keep churning it over. Cash the policy in, get your cash surrender value, and then get another policy somewhere else. Insurance companies hate that because that destroys the whole racket. As a result, the insurance salesmen are always told not to encourage people to do it. As a matter of fact, try to prevent them from doing it. You don't want to churn it over. That's unethical competition, they would say. It's okay to have a new policy, but not to get your new policy by getting the person to cash in the other policy. Once they do that, they realize the whole thing is a racket. At any rate, it results in an enormous piling up of resources and assets. Plus the fact that insurance companies are mostly non-profit. They're mutually owned. Most of them. Which means that the trustees don't really own the assets. Here they pile up an enormous amount of assets. They don't make any profits on them. As long as they don't go bankrupt, it's like colleges. As long as they don't go bankrupt, they can peg on forever. But there's no incentive to maximize your profits because there's no stockholders. There's no partners even, just trustees. Members of the board who have a sort of an altruistic function of keeping the thing going. So in other words, you have an enormous amount of capital piled up in life insurance, and it's a plum for financial groups to take hold of it. And the way the trustees are self-appointed. In other words, nobody chooses them. There's no stockholders. And so in the mutually owned companies, they have things like the depositor, quote, an owner, unquote. And so technically the depositor could vote for the board of directors. On the other hand, depositors can never vote. In other words, in the fine print it says you can't vote. So what happens is if there are 8 trustees or 12 trustees, they keep reappointing vacancies. They're self-perpetuating oligarchy. So what happens is by the late 19th century, these were taken over by various financial groups, the Morgans, the Rockefeller, they all had their own insurance company. And then they could take the assets and vote them to control their companies they want to control. That was Investment and Standard Oil, the Morgan companies, and vote with the way the Morgan people or the Rockefeller people want them to vote. They become allies, and so they don't actually lose a lot of money and go bankrupt. They don't care about making profit. So they become, in other words, voting allies of the Morgans, Rockefellers, Vanderbilt, whoever, whatever the financial group is. So this is by the late 19th century, by the 1890s or so, this becomes an important consideration. So in New York, for example, Metropolitan, I forget now which it is. 2 of them are Rockefeller, and the other 2 are Morgan, or something like that. Investment banking I've already talked about. Investment banking, oddly enough, has never been a corporation. It's always been a partnership. Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb, all these companies they're right now, as of this moment, they're becoming corporations. But from the beginning of investment banking until the present, they've been partnerships. One of the reasons for that is because they maintain secrecy. In other words, if you're in partnership, you don't have to have, make public accounting, you don't have to fulfill requirements. Nobody really knows what's going on. They can have secret deals without being in the public eye. They could just increase the number of partners. In the case of the Morgans, as we'll see in particular, they have political partners. In other words, 2 or 3 guys were assigned the task, almost did no investment banking. Their job was to put mergers together and to lobby in government and get government regulations they want, stuff like that. They became sort of political partners rather than strict investment bankers in the narrow sense. So as we'll see, by the 1890s, as we begin to have corporations in manufacturing, and the Morgans get into that, the Morgans begin to promote the idea of mergers, either cartels or mergers. Now, cartels doesn't work very well with railroads. So instead of cartels, they got another gimmick, namely, why don't we have a situation where all the companies, if there are 8 companies in one industry, why don't they all pool their resources and become one company and then they'll have a monopoly. Then they can raise the price. That was the idea. The great merger movement. We'll go into some details from this probably next time. Maybe Tuesday, next Tuesday. So the idea of the merger would act like a cartel, except you wouldn't have to worry about internal competition and cheating because they just merge into one corporation, or one holding company, or one trust as it was called. It was called a trust because they used the trust instrument. They have a trusteeship instrument. So the idea is this: okay, we'll take all the steel companies. Let's say there are 80 steel companies, all competing very vigorously. Why don't they all merge into one steel company? So U.S. Steel, which is the origin of U.S. Steel, by 1901, and then you see they can take all these, merge everything, and then they can take supply and they can cut the production and raise price. That's the whole point. In other words, they can dump some of the plants which are inefficient or whatever, dump that, and then we'll cut production and raise price and achieve their monopoly profits that they've been longing for. So and they did this, by the way, in late 1890s. With 2 merger waves. One was the early 90s. The major one was a few years, 1898 to 1901, where literally several hundred industries all have these monopoly mergers. A whole raft of them. I'll go into some examples a little bit later. Sugar refining, oil, steel, agricultural and machinery, the whole bit. And the interesting thing is that every one of these cases, virtually, the whole thing was a flopperoo. They're usually put through by the Morgans. U.S. Steel was a Morgan merger. General Electric, the idea of General Electric to have one merger monopoly company, that was also a Morgan. AT&T was Morgan, of course, they achieved a monopoly through government regulation, through patents and Federal Communications Commission later. All these things are reflections of an attempt, usually led by Morgans and others, to have a monopoly, and then they could cut production and raise price. It flopped every time. The reason it flopped was, first of all, monopolies are inefficient. We'll get to this a little later. The National Biscuit Company was originally a monopoly, attempt to have a monopoly. Monopolize all biscuits and cookies in the country, packaged cookies. It was all a flopperoo, because new companies would come in. See, even though they didn't cheat, even though they merged, they raised their profits, and immediately, hey, this is a monopoly company, got high profits, let's zip in there with a new plant, a better plant. All of a sudden they have new guys, new cookies, new sugar refining, new oil, new whatever. And then they're stuck. Then the whole cartel or merger is broken. The company loses a percentage of share all the time. Then they're stuck with 2 or 3 new permanent companies who are good competitors, have modern equipment, much more modern because they're new. Right? They come and zip brand new equipment. And they're stuck from then on. As a matter of fact, all these U.S. Steel, for example, is a classic case of a company which was a total flopperoo from the very beginning. It started with, they tried to get 100% of the market. They only achieved about 80 or something at the peak. And they kept losing shares all the time. They kept losing money, suffering losses. And from that day, from 1901 till the present, U.S. Steel has been a crummy company. They've been constantly losing their share of the market, always behind the new technology, the last people have put in the oxygen, whatever process, and always stumbling through life. And because they were built constructed as a monopoly and not as an efficient free market competitive kind of company. And the same thing happened to all the others, as we'll see. And what they had to do was to really compete, they had to shift gears. As we'll see with National Biscuit Company, it took them about 2 or 3 years. They said, we're through with this stuff. We're just going to try to compete because it's not working. So even though they didn't have any internal cheating, the external pressure was enormous to come in and nip in with new plants, new steel plants, new oil refineries, and all the rest of it. But this is, I'm just giving you a sort of an indication of the future. Yeah. Oh, that would be a tough thing to do, but they'd merge, and each one, in other words, they all pool their shares into one giant company. That's what Standard Oil did. That's what U.S. Steel did. You have like 80 companies, 20 companies, whatever it is. They take their shares and they pool them. They all become pro rata shareholders in a new company, with one big company. Of course, there are a lot of headaches to do it, but they usually agree like you're a head of one company, and your merger become president of the division of that company, something like that. They do that now in a sense. You merge with publishers, let's say, merge all the time. And the old publisher is bought out, but he still remains president for life of his division, until he retires, stuff like that. So they do things like that. They have agreements to do that. Well, yeah, they did. I mean, Carnegie, for example, built, as we'll see later when we get to steel, Carnegie built up a giant Carnegie Steel Corporation. He was a very good entrepreneur, a great steel man, but then he gets a little old. He figures he's ready to retire. He sells out to Morgan. He becomes part of U.S. Steel. He gets this huge amount of money, and he retires, becomes an elder statesman. So that's the way it's done. You get to the point where you're figuring, I've had it. Then I go to Europe or something, and you become part of the great Morgan Empire. So, but the key thing is it didn't work. It was a flopperoo, and because of this fantastic amount of new competition coming in. And we'll see how the same thing with Standard Oil. With Standard Oil, by the way, I'll repeat this in detail later. What happens with Standard Oil, Rockefeller never attempted to get a monopoly in crude oil or distribution or anything like that. Could never do it. He tried for a monopoly of oil refining, because refining is the most highly capitalized part of the industry. And he got at one point, he did it by buying them out, by having mergers, by what's your price, and they buy oil refineries. He got to the point where he got about 90% of oil refinery in the United States. And then what began to happen was that people began, let's say, I'll do this more detail later on, a little bit later, but what happened is this. People would know in the industry, hey, this guy Rockefeller is willing to buy every refinery built and then not use it. So he became sort of a sucker. In other words, people went into the business of building refineries so that Rockefeller would have to buy it. They didn't expect to use it. Now there's this jerk over there who's going to buy my refinery. And so they started also building fake refineries. Like it looks like a refinery, except there's no equipment. Right? A Potemkin refinery, if you want to call it that. This is a takeover of the so-called Potemkin village in Tsarist Russia. You have a big shot visitor to show the peasants are happy and smiling. They have a fake village consisting mostly of Tsarist police agents. Here's a village with happy peasants, and they show the people through, and 6 hours later when they go on, the village disappears. Of course, the communists did something similar later on. But anyway, it was called the Potemkin village, and so they had essentially a Potemkin refinery. It looked like a refinery, there's no stuff in it. So finally, Rockefeller at one point says, I'm sick of this. I'm losing money. I'm buying these damn refineries. I have nothing to do with them. As he put, I'm sick of playing blackmail these people. I'm stopping the whole thing. He stopped trying to keep a monopoly of refining. What then happened to him later on, by the way, I'm really skipping a lot, but what happened, and he was concentrated, as we'll see, in western Pennsylvania. That was his oil wells, and his refinery was in Cleveland. And so he had pipelines and transportation stuff, railroads to get the oil. His whole life was built on Pennsylvania crude oil. And they started around 1900 or so, they started oil discoveries, crude oil discoveries in Texas and Oklahoma. Rockefeller didn't believe it. I understand what people said, it's a flash in the pan. Their whole life was geared toward Pennsylvania. As a result, new firms, new young, tiny firms popped up, like Texaco and Gulf, to exploit the Texas oil fields. And Rockefeller, Standard Oil, was way behind on that. This is what happens to monopoly companies. They begin to lose out. They begin to get less innovative, bureaucratic, and they lose out on the competitive framework. The same thing happened, by the way, to skip totally to the current post-World War II period. In the photography industry, same thing happened to Eastman Kodak. Eastman Kodak used to have a monopoly of America, at least American photography, not of course worldwide. And so, in two cases, with two of the most dramatic improvements in photography since World War II, namely Polaroid and Xerox, in both cases, Dr. Land, the inventor of the Polaroid instant camera, and whoever the guy was who invented Xerox, I forget his name. In each case, they went to Eastman Kodak and said, here's the process, and offered to sell it to them. In each case, the guys, the experts, they said, it won't work. It won't work, it's too expensive, blah, blah, blah. They rejected it. They finally had to go to some bank or friends and get capital and just build their own company. Of course, I wish I had been in on the beginning. First 10 shares of Xerox or Polaroid. So that, in both cases, in other words, in both cases, these monopoly firms, or quote monopoly firms, unquote, were too set in their way, too bureaucratic, just missed out on the top new, top innovations in photography. So that's what happens. At any rate, another big thing that comes in the late 19th century, of course, is electricity. Fantastic new thing in power, and we'll see, by the way, how Standard Oil got caught short in a sense on that. The great guy there, one of the guys, the heroic figure there, of course, is Thomas Edison, great inventor and all that, the electric bulb and everything else connected with it. The interesting thing about Edison was, and also Westinghouse, the other great, I should say also Nikola Tesla. In both the case of Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, neither of them went to college, neither of them were scientifically trained. Now, it's not true that they were anti-science. They had scientists working for them. But they were creative geniuses, no question about that. They were also, the interesting thing about Edison in particular, he was very cost-oriented. In other words, his whole shtick was, how do we get a cheap electricity, cheap electric light for the masses, cheap electric power? The other inventors who were competing with him on the electric bulb, electric light front, were too entranced with the technology. They wanted elegant technologies, and they were like people like Maxim and other very good inventors, but they lost out on the competitive race, so they were interested in getting, for example, with a light bulb question, they wanted a perfect bulb that would last a long time. High resistance or low resistance? I forget which is, they wanted a low resistance bulb which would last 20 years. Unfortunately, it cost an enormous amount of money. It cost like $1,000 a bulb. So that was the sort of thing they were working on. Edison immediately saw that in order to have a you have a filament with high resistance, you want to have a cheap bulb, and he starts working on that, even though technologically it wasn't as elegant. A bulb which would blow out in a year or 6 months, but it would be much cheaper. And he starts in on that, and he gets a high resistance wire, copper wire, etc., which is very cheap. Then he gets it cheaper yet. He starts looking at trying to reduce the copper cost, and he gets enormous reductions in the cost, so that he can get a mass product, a cheaper product. And he gets the same thing with a dynamo. And he goes to the power station and the whole business. And each step of the way, he looks at where can we cut the cost. So instead of having electricity as sort of a toy for very rich people, which is essentially what it was at the beginning, the multi-millionaire can have one light bulb. But he's interested in mass production, so he can get a lot of profits. And so that's the way he went at it. He was a purely economically oriented inventor. And then he starts with, for example, in 1883, Edison has a light bulb, and he has a 3-wire system, he has a system. He couldn't figure out the cost of copper was still very high, and the cost of each bulb was $25. He was not going to work. And he's looking around for some way. He invents a 3-wire system, which cuts in the filament, which cuts the cost of copper per lamp from $25 to $1.50. So that's the way he was doing it. It was constant, dramatic, enormous reductions in cost. So you can have a mass production system. And after he works out the transmission network and the dynamo and everything else. And finally he says, we got to charge for this, baby. You're not going to have free electricity. And he invents the meter system, the whole idea of metering, and hooks it up with the rest of it. So, and metering per unit, per kilowatt hour used, et cetera, et cetera. So while his competitors like Maxim and Swan were looking for an elegant, technologically elegant, very durable bulb with low resistance, he immediately says, no, we want a cheap bulb. You have a high resistance filament, and starts reducing the copper cost. Still, these guys people like Edison wasn't right about everything. He had tremendous genius type ideas, say 10 of them, 8 of which would be great, 2 of which were totally off the wall. And then this is the way inventors apparently operate. So, for example, when he was working out his electric system, it was direct current. And George Westinghouse, another brilliant young, untrained, unscientific inventor, comes to him and says, no, he's with the idea of an alternating current. With direct current, you're limited in like a 10-block area. Alternating current, you can go, forever, practically. So Edison says, no, it won't work. And Westinghouse has to go and, get capital somewhere and start the Westinghouse Electric Corporation based on alternating current. Again, with much lower cost system. Westinghouse also had his own peculiar ideas. By the way, Edison insisted on running everything himself. Every detail of every area, and with him it worked. It doesn't work with everybody. Westinghouse, for example, tried to find an atmospheric engine. In other words, he wanted to get power out of the atmosphere, and he insisted it could work. They said it couldn't work, and in fact, it didn't. In fact, it didn't work. Although they tell me my engineering colleagues say they're now beginning to talk about that again. I don't know if they've actually done it. I'm glad they haven't done it. But obviously, if they ever do that, they have an unlimited source of cheap power. So to say these guys were right most of the time and very wrong other times, that's the way the thing works. You can't win them all. So with the electric light, with Edison and Westinghouse and all that coming in, as we'll see with oil, again with Standard Oil, etc., kerosene was the big oil product, and kerosene used for lamps. And so by 1890, 1900, kerosene lamps are replaced by electric lamps. And once again, Rockefeller didn't quite cotton to this. He kept insisting that kerosene was still the wave of the future when, of course, it was dying out. He didn't realize that gasoline was going to be a key as roads come in and automobile engines come in and trucks, etc. So again, Standard Oil, starting with a virtual monopoly of refining, begins to lose out to other firms, newer ones like Texaco and Gulf, etc. So no, we think gasoline is more important now. You got to catch the new trends. So so with the corporations coming in, stock exchange, of course, comes in. The New York Stock Exchange began around 1819. It was just a few stocks, really government bonds and a couple of bank companies. Then railroads come in, and by the 1870s, 1880s, stock exchange becomes a big thing, and it goes indoors. By the way, the American Stock Exchange used to be called the New York Curb Exchange until about the 1960s. The reason it's called a curb exchange, people used to sell stuff on the curb. They stand there on the street and they trade, and so eventually go indoors when it gets too big and the weather becomes unpleasant. We begin to have Edison sets up the Edison Electric Light Company. Westinghouse sets up the Westinghouse Corporation, which of course is still around. Edison was not impoverished. It's good to see somebody who was a great inventor who did not die impoverished. He died, of course, a multi-millionaire. And Edison Electric Company then falls into the Morgan ambit, and by, I think, formed General Electric by the late 90s. I have the exact date somewhere, which was an attempt to have a monopoly which never worked, because we always had Westinghouse who refused to go along with it. So Westinghouse stood outside, refused to go into the Morgan ambit, and slugged it out. And he got funds from his own friends himself, as we'll see later next time. Rockefeller essentially got funds from himself, his partner, his father, that sort of stuff. He sort of accumulated a little bit of money and started in. Okay, we now get to oil, and I'll spend the next time talking in depth about the oil industry. Oil starts, interestingly enough, petroleum starts. Petroleum, you think about, usually it's charged with capitalist development, industrial development, waste, or use a lot of resources. You have a lot of natural resources. As industry comes in, the natural resources disappear. In the case of petroleum, petroleum was not a natural resource until industry came along. Petroleum was just a pain in the neck. It was a big waste product. Just black ooze. Considered, and because there's nothing to do with it. Nobody knew what to do with it. There's nothing to be done with petroleum. What happened was, before the Civil War, the major lighting source was whale oil lamps. You've probably seen it in old movies, 18th century movies of sailing ships and the whale lamp. A whale was a common resource, okay? So, whale, unfortunately, you can say was whale communism, in the sense that if you kill a whale, you own it. But if the whales swimming around in the ocean, nobody owns. They're unowned property. You can't own a school of whales. You still can't own a school of fish. As a result, the incentive was to kill as many whales as possible. If you didn't kill a whale, your competitor would kill a whale. There's no incentive to conserve the whale population, because there's no private property in the whale school or whale bed, or whatever you call these guys. Okay? So there's usually a different word for a collective group of fish. As a result of fish communism or whale communism in the resource, you have an overuse of whales, and you begin to have a big whale shortage, a big whale scarcity. So, since there was a free market in whale energy, so to speak, what happened then is that as the supply of whales began to go down, the price of whale oil went up. As the price of whale oil went up, and they got more and more expensive, people began to look around for alternative energy sources. You didn't have an international energy commission to try to plan this. It's purely free market sort of setup. They saw whale prices were going on. We got to do something about it. What are we going to do about lamps? They started then looking at the technology and maybe an alternative source of lighting, and they came up with petroleum, the kerosene lamp. And they started using petroleum. Originally, they started with petroleum, which is sort of hanging around the surface of whatever. I don't know where it is, lakes or whatever. Obviously, there's not much of it. In the old days, nobody was using any. They had surface petroleum. They started using that. And they started the technology out, hey, this looks good. You can use kerosene lamps are even better than whale oil. They smell less badly and all that sort of stuff, and it's cheaper. And as a result of that, they began to drill for oil. The first oil well was Titusville, Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, and by God, they found lots of oil. As I said, western Pennsylvania becomes the big oil area, okay, and this remains that way until after 1900. And so, and then you begin to get refineries. The first big refineries were in Cleveland. They weren't very big at first. They were sort of small refineries and using, starting with commercial equipment or whatever. And John D. Rockefeller, by the way, fits the same so-called stereotype as Hill and Gould and all those other people. He was short, he was thin, 5'2" or something, 5 foot. He started off and fairly impoverished. His father was sort of a quack patent medicine salesman. He went around, one of these guys like in the movies, who said, buy this bottle and you'll cure all your hepatic, sciatic and cancer or whatever. And so, he was born, by the way, again in western New York. Therefore, of course, is a Republican. I mean, if you're not a Calvinist or a Catholic, there are very few Catholics in western New York, you're of course a Republican. And, his family moved to Cleveland. Yeah, I think his family moved to Cleveland when he was in high school. And as with Morgan, you'll find out that key Republican figures and key figures in the oil industry turn out to be guys who knew Rockefeller in high school or in grade school. If you knew Rockefeller in high school and grammar school, you were in. Okay, we'll resume that on Thursday.